welcome to the lecture on disability and trauma studies. This will be the first video of our second remote week. However, if you do watch them out of order, that won't mess you up too terribly, but following the schedule, this should be the first. We're going to finish out our critical theory this week. We're going to have a topic brainstorming activity later in the week as well. And I'm also going to assign our last Q&R paper, which will be a topic proposal to help you prepare again for this paper that you'll be writing. So the big question, of course, is what is disability studies? Well, partly we should consider, of course, that just like race and gender identity, sexual preference, class, nationality, all of these things are part of one's identity, and so is disability as well. It's a part of who people are. It's an innate chunk of somebody's identity, just like those other things I have listed. So that's an important thing, a foundational idea to keep in mind as we talk about this today. It's also useful to, in this particular school of thought, try and define what impairment is and what disability is. So this is kind of a little chunky point here. But generally speaking, oftentimes theorists in this school of criticism view impairment as that physical limitation a person may have, such as missing a leg or being partially blind or being deaf. The impairment is that actual physical limitation a person may have. However, the term disability refers to the social exclusion that may occur as a result of that impairment. So there's an order here. Impairment may lead to disability, but disability doesn't always follow impairment. That sounds weird, but this next little bit of this point can help clarify that. So, for example, somebody who has an impairment of their vision, right? They've damaged their ocular nerve, or perhaps they were born with it, and they're partially or wholly blind. That's an impairment. However, the way our society is built is inaccessible to this person who is partially or wholly blind. And that's particularly to blame because of the assumption that society has on what a normal body is, and it's certainly not an impaired one. Society is engineered to be most accessible to people who are not blind, who are not deaf, who have all their limbs, so on and so forth. So as a result, my next point, society fails to account for body diversity, and thus society disables this person. They exclude this person who is partially or wholly blind, who is deaf, who may experience cognitive impairment. They are excluded from parts or almost all of society as a result of the way in which our society functions. So we live in a disabling society. If we lived in a society that wasn't this way, then disability wouldn't follow impairment. But for the most part, we see that impairment leads to disability. If that clarifies, please let me know if you have questions kind of about how it works. But that, in general, is how theorists in this school of thought try to define those two ideas. There are also questions of eugenics, which I won't really explore, but there are ideas in eugenics, of course, being viewed as a war against the weak, right? Survival of the fittest. So sometimes a disability theorist might be interested in seeing how literature perhaps enforces or challenges this idea of how should impairment be accommodated, or should it be accommodated at all, right? You can expand this to all sorts of ideas where what is the assumption of normal and what a normal body is. And it's typically not one who is impaired in any way, shape, or form. So does literature set out to reinforce that model as well? So there's a lot of confusing things that might be going on here. Please let me know if you want clarification. But generally speaking, those are some things about disability studies. I'm also going to introduce a little bit of trauma studies here since I have grouped them together. Trauma studies also gets grouped with psychoanalysis quite a bit, which I will not be covering. But if you do want to talk about that, we can talk about that independently, or rather one-on-one, something like that in a Zoom if you're kind of curious and exploring that. But trauma studies explores the impact of trauma in literature by analyzing the rhetorical, the psychological, and cultural significance. Like, how is trauma being portrayed in literature? And I'm going to skip down to the third point here to kind of define that for you. So trauma is generally understood to be a severely disruptive experience that profoundly impacts the self's emotional organization and the perception of the outside world, right? So trauma that we experience can impact the way we interact with and view the world around us, but also how we function and organize ourselves on the inside. So, some other things to consider back to the second point is, how do we process trauma as individuals, right? Well, that's largely based upon psychological and social factors, how you perhaps were raised or the environment in which you grew up. May enforce how you engage with, understand, or live with trauma that you've experienced. So these are things you may want to consider as we continue to read Mrs. Dalloway, the social factors. And these are really complex things that you may be from the same town, but your family units are hugely different from each other. So even if you were growing up in the same geographical distance, or geological, I'm not sure what the word is there, you can still have widely different social factors at play here that can enforce or challenge the way you think about trauma. So moving on here, the big questions a disability theorist might ask when they're looking at a piece of literature would be, what does it mean to be normal? So oftentimes the idea of normality is based on the idea of an average man or the average person, someone who is, of course, not disabled, not impaired. And this ideology also frames disability as a minority, when in reality, disability and impairment is quite common. So this is also akin to how cissexual and cisgender, white even, middle class even, has become the normal image. You can also think about this when it comes to medicine, right? How are our medical students trained? Typically their body of reference is going to be a white man. There's quite a bit of discrepancy there with how do we practice medicine on people who don't fit that mold. That's a really interesting thing in the past couple of years that's been more explored. Another question somebody might ask is, how is disability being represented in the literature? How are normal bodies being constructed, and how is normalcy being reinforced? Is disability or impairment a catalyst or a plot device for the narrative? That'll be a pretty big thing. I think you will notice in Mrs. Dalloway. Are people with disabilities gendered differently? Are they more asexual? Are they feminized? Are they somehow made even more different than how they already are? Excuse me. How does disability, gender, race, nationality, class, etc. intersect? How do these identifying features intersect with each other to compose a character, for instance? Now, what symbolism is attached to disability, if any at all? You can note this to cathedral pretty easily. Is blindness tied to truth, for instance, right? Is there any kind of novelty attached to disability? Does the narrative refigure the ways we define the human body? Is the narrative challenging normalcy? How is prosthesis or prosthetics technology tied to the body? And how does it change the way we relate with our environment and our society? This isn't necessarily a question you might ask in Mrs. Dalloway, but if you find this school of thought to be really interesting, that is certainly something you could apply today with the amount of bioengineering that's really taken off, for lack of better words. And for the last bit here, some additional reading for you guys. Of course, I have the link here and on D2L for the Critical Disability Studies page at the Purdue OWL. David Richter's Companion to Literary Theory is a book. You have access to it through the databases, completely online. Has a lot of material about pretty much any type of criticism. I highly encourage you to look at that. If you are more interested in what we are studying in this class and about any other school of thought, I would highly encourage you to read that. It's organized basically in chapters covering different schools of thought. There is this dissertation I also found, Deborah McLeod, that was written in 2014. The chapter or the subchapter, The Sane and Insane Side by Side, does tackle Mrs. Dalloway in regards to modernist literature and how that engages with disability. This is not a source that I will allow you to use as part of your paper if you are doing a disability studies reading of the book, because generally speaking, dissertations and master's theses, for instance, are not considered scholarly. That isn't to say that they are unreliable, because they are, of course, supervised very closely by a committee of professors who are basically like your guidance counselors kind of for the project as a student. However, these works, dissertations and theses, are student work. So just like you couldn't cite me in a paper and I couldn't cite you, and you can't cite your peers in a paper, you cannot cite a master's thesis or a PhD dissertation. So you can read this to get an idea of what a theorist is doing with Mrs. Dalloway, but this is not something you can use as a source for that exact reason. If you have any questions about that, please reach out. But we have arrived at the end of today's lecture on disability theory. It's kind of a tough one to handle. So if you have any more questions, please reach out to me. And I'd be happy to either explain further or meet with you and talk about this. So have a great rest of your day, and we'll hear you in the next one, okay?